The sugar diet, for whatever reason, is super popular right now.
Sugar fasting is absolutely amazing. And it's not a fad, it's a revolution.
There have been some studies that suggest that if you are carnivore for a significant period of time, it actually impairs insulin sensitivity.
I've had so many ex-carnivores get a hold of me for help.
It ramps up your metabolic rate.
Dude, my caloric burn right now is way over 3,000. It's a joke.
It looks like it is the complete opposite of a ketogenic or carnivore diet. Let's just give the sugar diet the complete benefit of the doubt. Let's say that you can eat as much sugar as you want and effortlessly lose 5 pounds a week. Would I do the sugar diet in that setting? And the answer is still no. And here's why. I have gotten better since I started the ketogenic diet, and I continue to get better, which makes me excited about what I'll be able to do in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I don't think I would have that excitement if I was eating sweet tarts every single day. And we are live, ladies and gents. This episode is going to be a little bit different. So I'm doing a solo podcast, which I don't typically do. I don't have a guest this go around. So I'm doing a solo episode, and I'm going to be tackling a couple AMA Ask Me Anything questions. I've got 5 questions picked out here, and we're just going to dive on into it. This isn't really a question per se. I've actually just been inundated with questions lately around the sugar diet. So the sugar diet, for whatever reason, is super popular right now. I mentioned it on one of the prior work podcasts that Greg and I host together, and a lot of people in the comments and engagement on that, and it's very interesting. So the sugar diet is being promoted by several big names in the health and nutrition space. And I don't have anything bad to say about any of those guys. I mean, to each their own. I'm all for experimentation, doing what works for you, rock and roll. You know, Mark Bell, for instance, he's a good friend of mine. Like, we use his protein in some of the brick flavors. Like, I like Mark Bell. I've worked out with him. I've had him on the podcast. He's had me on his podcast. Like, I got nothing but respect for Mark Bell. And a lot of people are just negative in this space. Like, they're ganging up on people. I don't like seeing that. It seems as though the sugar diet is gaining prominence in the, carnivore community. There have been some studies that suggest that if you are carnivore for a significant period of time, it actually impairs insulin sensitivity. So some of these advocates for the sugar diet are suggesting that if you eat a lot of sugar, it actually improves insulin sensitivity. It ramps up your metabolic rate, increases your expenditure, fills you up, and provides just limitless energy. These are some of the claims being put out around advocates of the sugar diet. When you look into what they are suggesting or advocating for, promoting as far as things to consume, it's primarily, straight up sugar, like really, really high glycemic fruits, syrups, candies, high fructose corn syrup, things that are pretty much just pure sugar, fructose, glucose, sucrose, all the sugars. Very minimal dietary fat, incredibly lean sources of protein. And then there's been some debate as to what they recommend as far as, vegetables and starches go. So when you look at that from face value, high level, 30,000 foot view, it looks like it is the complete opposite of a ketogenic or carnivore diet. And it pretty much is from that regard. So can't really argue that. Everybody wants to lose body fat. Everybody wants to get leaner. Everybody wants to eat whatever they want and look great naked. All right. Who doesn't want that? Advocates for the sugar diet are suggesting that that is the best way to do it because, again, they're suggesting it increases caloric expenditure while allowing yourself to eat pretty much limitless sugars. I don't even think they're advocating tracking the caloric intake of those sugars. I don't even think that's part of the discussion. I think they're just recommending incredibly sugary foods. They're also promoting something lately called sugar fasts, in which you only consume sugar for sometimes multiple days at a time in the complete absence of proteins or dietary fats in their totality, which is an interesting one to me. So I have played around with carbohydrate backloading in my pre-keto days. Carbohydrate backloading, for those of you that do not know, is basically eating a bunch of high glycemic index carbs right before going to bed. So I did something similar to that back then. It wasn't called the sugar diet at the time. I also, before falling into the ketogenic lifestyle, was doing a traditional bro diet, or if it fits your macros, flexible dieting approach. Flexible dieting, if it fits your macros, is, known for Pop-Tarts. Now, people in that space don't like that it's known for Pop-Tarts, but that is oftentimes what people think of when they think of flexible dieting. Eat Pop-Tarts and get shredded. And for me, we all have a psychological relationship with food, whether it's good or bad. We all have a psychological relationship with food. Some people are moderators, some people are eliminators. This could be a whole podcast on the psychology of food in and of itself. But that's not what I want to do here. Let's just give the sugar diet the complete benefit of the doubt. Let's say that it does significantly increase metabolic rate. Let's say that you can eat as much sugar as you want and effortlessly lose 1 to 5 pounds a week eating, Nerds, candy, and Sour Patch Kids. Let's say that is the case, all right? Let's also give it the benefit of the doubt in suggesting that from a longevity standpoint, there is no ill effect, no recourse, no adverse response downstream. That one I'd be very hard-pressed to believe because, I look at my grandmother, who is pretty much following the sugar diet. I mean, she doesn't really eat much protein, not near enough for what she needs, and the protein she does eat is typically lean because she doesn't like much dietary fat, and she eats way too many sweets. So my grandmother is pretty much doing the sugar diet. She's starting to show signs of dementia and Alzheimer's, so that's not really a good argument in favor of the sugar diet. But let's put that aside. Let's just assume that in the acute setting, it does ramp up your metabolic rate and that you get leaner, you lose body fat. Okay, there's obviously benefits there physiologically, if that were in fact true. Let's also give it the benefit of the doubt and say that there are no ill effects long-term from a longevity standpoint. Okay, so now we're really giving it all the benefits of the doubt here. Would I do the sugar diet in that setting? And the answer is still no, and here's why. One of my primary reasons for really loving the ketogenic diet, of which I would consider myself ketogenic, not so much carnivore. I'm pretty much carnivore except for, random vegetables on occasion or the keto brick or something like that, but definitely heavily meat-based. One of my big reasons for adopting this as a lifestyle in the first place is that it goes beyond the metabolic impact, it goes beyond the longevity impact, and it actually puts a lot of emphasis on the environment and knowing your local farmer and rancher. And that's something that I'm incredibly passionate about. I take pride in the fact that I source all of my meat from farmers and ranchers that I know personally, and I've gone to their ranch and shook their hand and met them, and I know exactly what that animal's eating, or food that I've harvested myself through hunting or raised myself, on our own property. I take a lot of pride in that because I know that I'm doing right by the animal's welfare. I know that I'm doing right by the environment. I know that I'm doing it right by my local community in dealing directly with these farmers and ranchers and not supporting the commodity beef system and all of the things that it leaves to be desired. So for that reason alone, I would stick with a ketogenic approach because I'm making a bigger impact in my local community and for the livelihood and well-being of the planet and the animals within it. And that may sound too woo-woo for some, but the reality is we vote with our dollar and we all eat food. So the compounding effect of that makes a massive difference over time. And I want to be on the right side of history in knowing that I'm eating nutrient-dense foods that are literally the most nutrient-dense that the planet has to offer, and I'm doing so in a way that respects that animal and pays homage to the farmers and ranchers that raise them correctly. So that, for me, is a massive reason why I'm so in love with this ketogenic carnivore approach as a lifestyle. And I don't think the sugar diet would ever be able to make a more compelling argument, because when you're eating Sour Patch Kids, who's benefiting there? Big food corporations that are focused on improving their margin and producing things with inexpensive, low quality, if you want to call it food ingredients, I guess you could, but I think that's even a stretch. So that's not who I want to vote with my dollar. That's not who I want to support. So again, if we were to give the sugar diet all the benefits of the doubt and say that it has massive upside acutely, metabolically speaking, and no downstream negative side effects, which again, I don't think it does, then I would still go the route of eating foods that are animal-based, sourced from the highest quality sources I can find, and paying it forward towards from an environmental standpoint. So there's that. And then I guess to just round this off, you got to look at diet as a lifestyle. It can't be a diet. Like, diet doesn't even need to be in our vocabulary, really and truly. Like, we are the byproduct of our day-to-day decisions. And when you have this short-sighted approach to anything you do, I just don't really put much stock in it. Like, I want to make decisions that I know are going to compound over my lifetime and pay it forward for those around me and my health and my ability to provide and just be the best version of myself possible. And to me, it makes a lot more sense to focus on, from a food standpoint, eating the highest quality, most nutrient-dense, well-sourced foods that I can possibly find. And that's why the ketogenic carnivore approach is the only option that seems to make sense in my mind. So yeah, there's that. And again, I struggled with eating disorders. I struggled with binge eating and purging, as I know a lot of people have. We are creatures of, we are interesting creatures as human beings. We want to really double down on endorphins and dopamine and short-sighted, euphoria. And when you're eating a bunch of, just sweets, you're just illustrating that case perfectly. When you're making decisions in your parenting or in your business or in your career or in your life that are really just fixated on the moment, the here and now, and not the long game approach, like, I have a hard time with that. I like the fact that I've played around with so many different diets. Like, I did the flexible dieting, carb backloading, if it fits your macros, bro diet, all that stuff long before keto. They all had pros and cons, but for me, I've been strict keto now for 10 or 11 years because it's worked. My relationship with food has improved. My performance markers have improved. My health recovery, all that stuff has improved. My biomarkers, my blood work, everything. I became 3.9% body fat, the leanest man on planet Earth at that time. Got my pro card in natural bodybuilding, and continue to get better every single year that passes. I have gotten better since I started the ketogenic diet, and I continue to get better, which makes me excited about what I'll be able to do in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I don't think I would have that excitement if I was eating sweet tarts every single day, but that's just me. So maybe more of a psychological than scientific approach to my rebuttal for the sugar diet. And again, I'm not trying to throw any shade to anybody that's doing it. To each their own. Everybody's got to walk their own path in life and figure out what works or doesn't work for them. But I've been just inundated with questions and people requesting response to all of this hype. So there's my 2 cents on the matter there. Don't look at what you eat as a diet. Look at it as a lifestyle. What kind of lifestyle do you want to live for the remainder of your life? From today to tomorrow to the day you lay your head down and take your last breath. For me, I feel really good about doing what I'm doing with the ketogenic approach. So that's that. Ethan asks, what are your thoughts on a ketogenic diet for children? Keto first foods for infants? ? Do children and infants need carbohydrates, need variety? What about nut allergies? What did you do for yours? All right, so great question. I've been keto for over a decade. My wife, Crystal, has been keto for probably about 9 years now, and she was ketogenic all throughout her pregnancy with our first son, Rigel. She's been ketogenic all throughout her second pregnancy with our second son, Hazen, due next month. And our son, Rigel, who is now 3 years old, he just turned 3 a weekend ago, he's been ketogenic since birth. So we went the whole breastfeeding route. Breast milk is obviously containing some, sugar in the form of lactose. It's also got, some fats in there, so pretty ketotic by nature. And he was breastfed for the first, 6 months, and so he started showing interest in food. From that point, we started incorporating the same foods we eat, honestly. So his first, I think I've got a picture of it, his first food, like legitimate food item, apart from breast milk, was this massive beef knuckle bone with a bunch of gelatin and collagen on it that we had put in the slow cooker for several hours. And he was just gnawing down on that. He eats the exact same thing Crystal and I do. We don't go and get foods for him off of the kids menu. We never used formula with him. We never used the, kids purees or just the kids food that you see in the grocery store aisles dedicated for kids. He eats literally the exact same thing we eat. He loves, full fat yogurt. He eats a lot of that. He'll have some berries, but not many berries. He loves the keto bricks. He's not on a keto brick more often than not. And he loves ground beef, ground lamb, ground elk, and eggs. We'll scramble that together, and he loves that. He loves salt. He'll just, he'll lick salt up like it's crazy. So he does a lot of electrolytes through just plain sea salt or Redmond salt. And he's totally fine. He's on the upper 99th or 98th percentile of all the growth metrics for his peer group. So he's developing, right on par there or above the average there. So feel pretty good about that. His level of acuity and just awareness and ability to pick things up and learn and have critical thinking is improving day by day. And I attribute a lot of that to the quality of the food that he eats. One of the books that I highly recommend for parents to be is a book by Catherine Shanahan called Deep Nutrition. That was a really good one. We read that before our first pregnancy. And when you really start to dive into, just the quality of nutrition, how big an impact that makes on their development in the fetus, and then once they're born and onward, you really start to prioritize the nutrition you're giving your kids. He doesn't have any nut allergies, to answer your question there. We've introduced nuts. We've introduced everything gradually. So dairy, nuts, any of the known allergens we've introduced, and he's not had an issue with any of them. So no concerns there. And again, a lot of people will say you have to have carbohydrates for, growing adolescents to develop, but he's on the upper percentile for all of the growth metrics in his age bracket, and he doesn't have any of those carbohydrates. I mean, he'll have, again, just the carbohydrates from trace sources, the little bit in berries, low glycemic berries like, blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, some strawberries on occasion, and then what's naturally occurring in, yogurt and things of that nature. But not much on the carbohydrate front for him, and it hasn't seemed to negatively impact him whatsoever. We'll make, keto birthday cakes for him. We'll make things like that on special occasions. He loves it. He doesn't know any different, but he's totally fine not having the typical carbohydrate-based foods. He'll show an interest in, candies and things like that at the grocery store simply because they're brightly colored and packaged for kids, but it's not something that he's feeling like he's missing out on by not having. And he's totally fine having every food that we've given him. We'll make, electrolyte gummies and things like that using beef gelatin. He loves those. So, yeah, super healthy and totally void of dietary carbohydrates. So that's what we've done. Do what's right for you as a parent, but I think giving your kids quality nutrition from the get-go and continuing that through their upbringing is of paramount importance. So that's what I would recommend in that regard. So appreciate the question, Ethan. The next thing we have is from Aaron, and Aaron asks, I'm reading my computer here, your ketogenic bodybuilding book mentions that lactate buildup lessens when fat adapted. How do I know if I'm working out hard enough without that soreness signal? I used to get crippling, let's see what you say here. I used to get crippling DOMS, so delayed onset muscle soreness, before keto 3 years ago, but lately I'm lifting to failure in 3 to 8 rep range and feeling nothing, more sets, more volume, ? So I noticed this myself. I would get incredibly sore. I used to do like a body part split where I would be training, a dedicated leg day, a dedicated, chest day, things like that. And one of the reasons I did that was because I was getting so sore from leg day, for instance, that I would not physically be able to train legs again until the next week. And that would oftentimes be, with inflammation in my knees and joints, and it just hurts to do so. I don't get that at all anymore. I don't get DOMS. I don't get late onset muscle soreness. And I train pretty much full body at this moment. So I'm training every single body part every single day, typically 5 days a week, sometimes 6 days a week. So I'm never really getting so sore where I can't train. I'll get sore if I'm doing a movement that I haven't done in quite some time, but it's never like a crippling soreness. So yes, you are correct. When you become more deeply fat adapted, you increase the number of monocarboxylic transporters, MCT transporters throughout your body. Those are used to shuttle ketone bodies, but also lactate and pyruvate. So you're able to flush and clear that lactate much more efficiently, and you oftentimes don't have that burning sensation of muscle failure that you get when you hit near muscle failure with a given exercise. However, that doesn't mean you can just lift invincibly and not have a failure point. What I experience now is oftentimes more just a sheer inability to move that weight. It's not so much a burning sensation, so much it is, this weight is just, I can't lift this weight at this stage. I need to recover. It's not a pain. It's just more a matter of, I can't physically hit this rep right now. But it's never accompanied by that dull, aching, burning sensation that was, stereotypical of hitting muscle failure in the past when I was dependent upon carbohydrates. So how do I know when I'm ready to train again? How do I know that I'm actually progressing in the gym? The answer to that is simply looking at my metrics. So I'm using my workout app to track my lifts over time, and I'm looking to make sure that I am in fact progressively overloading my training sessions. So seeing an increase in volume in some form or fashion, or being able to move more weight on the bar over time, which is always the case. So I know that I'm getting stronger and therefore building more lean tissue. Don't gauge your ability to, kill it in the gym based solely off of how sore you are the next day. That's not really a good predictor of progress or indicator of having a good lifting session. Like, if you're going hard, if you're giving it, the intensity that it deserves. And what I like to do is hit muscle failure on the last set of a given exercise, which actually bodes pretty well for my full body training split, because when I'm doing full body, again, I'm only picking one exercise for that muscle group. So oftentimes people will not recommend training to failure on, flat barbell bench press, because the next exercise may be, dumbbell flies also for chest. If you hit muscle failure on bench press, then your flies will be hindered. But since I'm doing full body and only training one exercise per muscle group, if I go to failure on that last set of every exercise, it's not really impeding the next exercise because it's not the same muscle group. So that's what I would recommend. Like, go hard, go heavy, lift intensely. And realistically, if you're training, if you're having 48 hours between a similar exercise, for instance, if I'm going really hard and heavy on squats on Monday, I probably wouldn't go super hard and heavy on leg press on Tuesday. I might do something more like, a good morning or a hamstring curl. But then on Wednesday or Thursday, then I would do another heavy leg movement, compound movement, like a sumo deadlift or a leg press or something of that nature. So feel free to train more frequency. That's one of the benefits of not having that lactate build up, being able to clear and flush that more efficiently, is you are able to train more frequently. And if you're able to train more frequently without risking injury, then you're likely going to be able to progressively overload those training sessions and, hit those PRs and build more strength and hypertrophy. So, and that would be my recommendation for you there. Appreciate the question, Aaron. All right, next one is brought to us by Wade. We got a long one here. All right, so Wade asks, I should probably find a better way to do this than looking at a computer. Will having carbohydrates around larger protein meals during bulking, so building, help offset gluconeogenesis and its potential impact on higher glucose, lower ketone levels? So, Wade, I would not recommend carbohydrates around protein meals in a building phase. You're trying to do this to basically minimize the effect of gluconeogenesis and in theory, I'm assuming, keep your ketone levels higher and your glucose levels lower. The thing is, when you are in a building phase, ideally, you are in a caloric surplus. You're taking in more overall fuel to support the synthesis of more lean tissue and recovery from those more intense, higher volume, heavier training sessions. So you don't really need to worry about, having carbohydrates and gluconeogenesis and things like that. By being in a surplus, you're likely going to see a reduction in ketones, blood ketones, and likely a slight increase in blood glucose, simply because you're eating at a surplus. When you're in a deficit, your body's going to be metabolizing stored body fat more readily. So by default, you're going to have higher ketones in a deficit. So don't fall victim to just becoming a slave to measuring your glucose and ketones. I think it's a great thing to do, especially if you're experimenting with a different food or trying to manipulate something, or just trying to know and learn your body and what foods impact it differently. But don't feel like you have to test those on a regular basis. When you're in a building phase, you're consuming a surplus of calories, you will likely see a drop in blood ketones and an increase in blood glucose simply by way of eating more overall food. You're going to have more energy coming in. You're probably going to have higher trace carbohydrates by simply eating more food. For instance, I'm typically keeping my total carbohydrates at 20 grams or less, which is pretty easy for me to do. But if I'm really pushing the needle on how much total food I'm consuming to where I'm north of 3,000 or north of 3,500 calories, I'm simply eating more food. So I'm going to be getting more trace carbohydrates from that. So my total carbohydrate consumption for the day may be more towards 30 or maybe even 40 grams a day, which is still incredibly low by modern day standards, but you're likely going to be consuming more trace total carbs anyways. And again, you're going to see a reduction in ketones and an increase in glucose simply because you're eating more food. So don't worry about gluconeogenesis because if you're at a surplus, you're going to be taking in plenty of amino acids and protein to support that muscle building and recovery. So your body's not going to preferentially turn to gluconeogenesis to make up a void for lack of protein and amino acids. So don't worry about that. And for that reason, I certainly wouldn't recommend consuming carbohydrates around protein meals to hedge against that gluconeogenesis because it's not really going to be an issue at a surplus anyways. All right, next question. Actually, this is the longer one. So this is from Lindsay. And she says, "Hi, Robert. I hope this isn't too wordy. Feel free to omit any irrelevant info. My details are provided just for context. So, do protein calories really count when it comes to being in an energy surplus or deficit? I know protein has a higher thermic effect of food, so 20 to 30% of calories are burned during digestion, but I'm wondering about the other 70 to 80%, trying to figure out which, if any of the following statements is true. Statement number 1. Protein is purely structural, and the body does not treat it as an energy source except through gluconeogenesis. If I'm understanding gluconeogenesis correctly, it's a demand-driven process, so there wouldn't be any excess. It's happening because the glucose is needed for energy, not just because the protein is available. If all this is true, what happens to any protein consumed beyond what the body needs for either structural purposes or gluconeogenesis? Is it excreted or ... And statement number 2 is protein consumed in excess of what the body needs for structural purposes and gluconeogenesis is stored as fat. So she's trying to figure out which of those two is true. And then she says, I'm asking because it's no trouble for me to keep carbs under 15 grams every day, and I vary my fat intake most days 75 to 80 grams. I'm assuming that's 75 to 80 grams of dietary fat, which is honestly not very much. 1 time a week, about 130 grams of fat. But it's super easy for me to eat well over 150 grams of protein a day, and I'm wondering if that could be slowing down fat loss. I've been keto 90% carnivore for about 5 years, 44, female, 5'3", 125 pounds, strength, train 5 times a week, trying to lose a bit more body fat. All right, Lindsay. This is an interesting one. Protein's always debated in the space. So regardless of what diet you're following, a general recommendation is to consume about 1 gram of protein per pound of lean mass. Like that's thrown around in multiple different circles, whether it's the keto carnivore space or the bro dieting space or flexible dieting if it fits your macro space. That's usually a pretty good bet to hedge against any muscle loss. You also see it as 0.8 to 1.2 kilograms per pound or per kilogram body weight. There's a lot of different ways people put it. I typically use protein as a lever that I manipulate depending on the phase that I'm in, whether I'm in a building phase trying to build more muscle, or if I'm in a fat loss phase trying to prioritize getting leaner. So the notion that protein is just there for structural purposes and those calories don't count is very, very far-fetched. A lot of people do believe that, but I do not recommend that approach. There is a higher thermic effect of food in protein. It does require more energy for the body to assimilate that nutrition throughout the digestion and metabolic process. But it requires more energy to break down and assimilate protein than it does carbohydrates and dietary fat. But in the grand scheme of things, the slight increase in thermic effect of food from protein doesn't negate the fact that there is a caloric load to that protein. So I don't ever really recommend basing your estimations or manipulations off of it having a slightly higher thermic effect of food. When you look at my macro calculator, most macro calculators, for instance, they'll take into account, your sex, your age, your weight, your body fat percentage, and they'll typically use some form of activity multiplier based off of, what your day-to-day activity expenditure and, rough estimates are. They don't really ever factor in thermic effect of food because it's so minuscule in the grand scheme of things that it doesn't really make sense to use that as a primary manipulated variable. So if that is the case, and protein is very important for structural needs, for repairing and recovering muscle tissue damage and breakdown from training, for building more muscle tissue, for preserving lean tissue, all that good stuff, you want to make sure you're checking the boxes there and consuming enough amino acids to not become catabolic and lose that lean tissue. But the notion that you can just eat protein in excess without any ill effect is very misplaced. So for that reason, I'll typically have protein higher when I'm in a building phase, knowing that I'm likely going to be, depending on how high I take it, potentially minimizing my efficiency of fat metabolism because protein is potentially in excess, and I could be kind of leaning into gluconeogenic territory there to some extent. But I just kind of listen to my body and figure out at what point I've hit that protein threshold for me individually at that stage and phase in my life. When I am dropping my caloric intake and focusing on fat loss and preserving as much lean tissue as possible, it becomes a variable that I do manipulate. It's a lever that I can pull. And I'll typically start at a very high fat ratio of about 80% when I'm starting a competition prep. At that point, I'm taking in enough calories that I'm not really going to be risking catabolism or loss of lean tissue because I am consuming pretty much my maintenance intake at the start of a competition prep. And I'll gradually increase protein until I hit that protein threshold. And then once I hit that threshold, I'll start gradually dropping it down. So by the end of my fat loss phase, I'm consuming relatively low protein intake by mainstream standards of what I should be consuming based off of my height, weight, and stats and expenditure. However, because I am so deeply fat adapted, as you would be as well, following this diet for 5 years, you've got all the benefits of ketones, which are also incredibly muscle sparing. So you've got that working in your favor. Plus, you've got the added benefit of, when you are deeply fat adapted, your body's energy is coming from primarily fat, whether it's dietary fat or stored fat. So it's not looking to carbohydrates or primarily gluconeogenesis in the absence of carbohydrates to fill that void. It can use fat metabolism to answer most of the body's energy demands. And the minuscule amount that the brain needs in glucose, it can derive internally through gluconeogenesis. So there's not really any risk of, you having muscle wasting take place if you have a very short period of time at the end of a prep or fat loss phase where your protein is a bit lower. And when I typically get to that phase where my protein is lower, at that point, I'm introducing ketogenic caloric refeeds once or twice a week. Those always come with a bolus dose of both fat and protein. So I'm kind of covering my bases there as well. So I wouldn't really worry about losing muscle if you are not consuming too much protein for a finite period of time. Now, on the other side of the equation, what about does consuming too much protein hinder fat loss? And I would argue it most certainly does, because again, despite that higher thermic effect of food, those calories still count. And if you are consuming an excess of calories from protein, those are still going to be in excess of calories. Also, if you are consuming too much protein relative to dietary fat, which it sounds like you may be based off of your question, then that will likely hinder your body's ability to prioritize fat metabolism and derive its primary energy from fat as a fuel substrate, whether it be dietary or stored fat. So I would personally opt for a higher fat intake and a little bit lower protein in your situation here. Another thing I've noticed, this is anecdotal, but I've noticed this in myself and amongst many of the clients I've worked with, is once we've transitioned out of the fat loss phase and we've gone into a reverse diet, we'll ramp overall calories up, both fats and proteins, until we find their new maintenance intake that they can sustain and make that higher intake, more enjoyable, more manageable, more appropriate for going into a building phase. What I have noticed is that when they go really aggressive with the protein intake, post-fat loss phase, they tend to put on more body fat than if they were to keep those calories equated and have a higher fat ratio. So I've got a few ideas as to why this could be the case. I noticed this myself in my own reverse diet from my 2023 competition prep. I was following my written protocol to the T, keeping my overall fat ratio higher, and then I decided to experiment with more protein relative to fat, calories equated, that's key, and I started putting on more body fat. And again, I think it's because primarily my fat metabolism was hindered, which hindered my body's ability to, create energy and have a higher expenditure and actually burn some of that body fat. So my glucose was higher, my ketones were lower, I felt more brain fog, I had more inflammation, had more joint pain. It wasn't as good. I was retaining more fluid, more water in my subcutaneous layer of skin because of that higher glucose, higher inflammation, and just higher protein intake. So the next time I go through a competition prep, when I am reverse dieting out of it, I will likely prioritize that higher fat ratio, which kind of becomes challenging because, as we all know, protein has more volume. It's got fewer calories. It's got fewer calories per gram than fats, obviously. So it's very tempting to just consume more protein because you're going to get more volume there, and your body craves volume after coming out of a deficit. But if you do so to the extent of not having ample dietary fat and you're just consuming way too much protein, again, your fat metabolism is going to be hindered, and you're likely going to be creating more glucose, and you just won't feel as good. You're going to feel more bloated, and you will put on more body fat. So one thing I've really tried to focus on lately is, as my clients reverse out of their fat loss phase, make sure that fat ratio is still relatively high. It doesn't have to be near as high as at the beginning of that fat loss phase, but there's no need to drop it down crazy low for fear of having too many calories, or crank that protein up way too much in excess, because you don't want to hinder body's efficiency at fat metabolism, at metabolizing fat for fuel if you are adopting a ketogenic or carnivore approach. That's the benefit of a ketogenic or carnivore approach. So that's what I would say there. Given your two statements, I would say 2 is likely the case. Protein consumed in excess of what the body needs for structural purposes and gluconeogenesis is stored as fat because those calories still count. So appreciate the question very much, Lindsay. All right. Well, we got one more question here from Sheriff, I believe is the pronunciation. And they say, "Hey, Rob, so I have been doing keto for a few months now, and I have started having issues with sleeping recently. I've Googled about it, and keto insomnia is common. Do you have any advice about dealing with this? Also, what do you recommend on refeed days? I'd also like to know how often you do refeed and what you eat, since I'm lost in that area. I've added creatine back into my diet as I've noticed it's helping with my energy output. As far as cardio, I've only been doing walking cardio at the gym for roughly an hour and doing 24 to 36 hour fasting on Sunday. I'm still strength training like normal. I'd love to hear back from you." So as it pertains to the refeed days, I have not had a carbohydrate refeed day in over a decade. I'll do a ketogenic caloric refeed day of fats and proteins as I'm getting closer to a competition day to help fill out muscle glycogen, to help provide more energy and just allow myself to relax a little bit more, and just fill out, and I'll tweak electrolytes a little bit on those refeed days so that I can draw the subcutaneous fluid between my muscle and my outer layer of skin into my muscle so that my skin appears thinner, I've got more vascularity on show day, and my muscles appear fuller. I'm assuming you're asking about carb refeeds though, but again, I do not do those and I don't recommend them. There's not really any need to, especially as you become more deeply fat adapted. So as it pertains to your fasting question, you said you're doing 24 to 36 hour fast once a week. Depending on what your goals are, I don't have anything against fasting, but I see far, far too many people fast far too often. So keep in mind that being in a caloric deficit is a stressor on the body, and that also provides many of the same benefits that fasting does. And if you're doing both fasting and putting yourself into a caloric deficit simultaneously, then you're likely causing too much stress or more stress than is necessary. So I wouldn't really recommend extended fasting while also dieting into a deficit for a fat loss phase. It's not really necessary. As far as your primary question, which is concerning sleep, yes, this is common. A lot of people will notice, lack of sleep when they first start doing a ketogenic diet. Once you have more ketones in circulation, those cross the blood-brain barrier, so you may have more cognitive function and mental energy, which may make it more challenging to fall asleep at night. And that oftentimes passes once your body kind of acclimates to that new metabolic approach. But for me, I've also struggled with sleep, not so much from being keto, but just from being an entrepreneur and having a million things coming at me at all times and just being really stressed. And what I've done is I've really revamped my sleep hygiene. So what I'll typically do is just kind of bulleted list going down my sleep hygiene list is I will turn the thermostat down quite a bit before going to bed. So about 64 degrees. For me, I would go colder, but my wife and kiddo don't like it colder. So 64 degrees. I'll use blackout curtains. I actually wear a sleep mask over my eyes so that there's no impeding light coming in to disrupt my sleep from night lights or anything like that. So blackout curtains or an eye mask works great in that regard. I'll take about 400 milligrams of magnesium from upgraded formulas prior to going to bed. And that seems to make a difference. I'll do, what else do I do? A lot of people, when it comes to food around sleep, they'll try to avoid eating right before bed. And it kind of just depends on where I'm at. If I'm eating at a caloric surplus and I've just got more food coming in general, I'm not really worried about losing body fat, then I will also try and do that. I'll try to avoid having my last meal, right before bed. However, when I'm in deficit and I'm dieting down for a show and my body fat is much lower, I actually find that eating right before bed is beneficial. It puts me into more of a parasympathetic state. I'm able to relax because I'm in a deficit and leaner. That kind of ramps up sympathetic nervous state and, amplifies stress all the more. So by actually eating a full meal, relaxing, and then just going to bed soon after, I sleep better. And that's been evident in all of my aura, ring readings, but just also how I feel and how I feel when I wake up the following day. So don't become too, particular on meal timing as it pertains to sleep quality and just, have one thing as it's set in stone. Play around with that, see what works best for you. Another thing you can do as far as your food goes around your meal timing before bed, I would not recommend having an incredibly lean protein source immediately before going to bed. If you're going to have a meal before bed, try and make sure it's at least equal parts in grams fat to protein or higher in fat if possible. I sleep much, much better if I've got a bolus dose of fat before going to bed than if I were to have a bolus dose of protein. The protein will increase blood glucose. That takes longer to digest. Doesn't take longer to digest than fat, but it tends to hinder sleep quality due to how protein is absorbed and assimilated relative to fat. So I don't typically recommend a really lean protein source before going to bed, especially in isolation. Make sure you're having a fat source with it or just simply a fat source. Another thing I'll do is a lot of people have problems with waking up multiple times throughout the night to take a leak, urinate, which obviously hinders sleep quality. So one thing you can do is have a slight bolus dose of sodium before going to bed. That will again, similar to before stepping on stage, draw the fluid into your muscle tissues. And if it's in your muscle tissue, it's not going to be in your bladder. So if you have a small dose of sodium before going to bed, you may notice that helps make it through the night without having to wake up to pee. So that could be helpful as well. Another thing is just simply not doing anything stimulatory right before going to bed. So I don't like training in the evening. I like training first thing in the morning. I don't like watching something that's super, intense, like a chase movie or like a murder scene or something like that. Like I'll try and watch something or nothing. Reading a book is great. I'll read a book to my kiddo. We'll dim the lights down and we'll just kind of transition into relax mode prior to going to bed. So that helps me quite a bit. So try playing around with just sleep hygiene and what you're doing there. And that's that, ladies and gents. Hopefully you found a value in this solo podcast, AMA style. I might do some more of these. These 5 questions that were submitted, I'm going to hook every single one of these people up with some free keto bricks. I've got an AMA link in the description of this YouTube video. So if you want to throw in a good question there and I use your question on one of these videos, then I'll hook you up with some free bricks as well. But appreciate y'all for tuning in. Let me know if you like this solo format, if you definitely prefer having a guest, or if you like just mixing it up, and I'll sprinkle in a couple of these from time to time. Appreciate y'all for tuning in. Talk to you next time.